Who are some of the boom or bust prospects the Panthers should be looking at in this year's draft? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show right here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter and Blue Sky, because tomorrow is the weekly Friday mailbag here on Locked On Panthers, and all you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council or at me over on Blue Sky at Julian Council to get your questions in for tomorrow's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. 2 weeks away from night one of the 2025 NFL draft. We continue our countdown on today's show, and we're looking at boom or bust prospects that Carolina could look at either there in 2 weeks on night one or potentially day two, maybe even later on in the draft. But I want to focus on three guys on today's show, and one of them actually visited Carolina on Wednesday for a top 30. His name is Terrance Ferguson of the University of Oregon, and Spencer McLaughlin is our host of Locked On Ducks here on the Locked On Podcast Network. He's going to join us a little bit later on to discuss Terrance Ferguson and whether he could fit here in Carolina. Maybe even ask about Jordan Burch, who was at South Carolina from Columbia, came on a local visit not too long ago, played at Oregon the last couple of years. He's an edge rusher. Maybe he could make sense for Carolina. So going to talk to Spencer a little bit later on here on the show, but focusing on three guys who could be boom or bust prospects for the Panthers that I do think they should be looking at in this year's draft. All three of them play three different positions I think Carolina probably should address pretty early on in this year's draft. Starting off with Shemar Stewart from Texas A&M. And there is a ton of conversation over Shemar Stewart, who looks like a guy who would come in and be dominant. But when you look at what he's done in college, you're kind of left scratching your head wondering, okay, well, he looks chiseled like a Greek god. Why is it that he has not produced at that level and dominated in the SEC at A&M? Looking at PFF, that's Pro Football Focus, he's 28th on their big board. Their rundown of him saying Stewart is a scheme versatile, high potential athlete who is still working on winning his reps with technique and discipline as much as athletic ability. His lack of production throughout his college career speaks to the lack of refinement in his game, but he is built like a future NFL player and should be a day two pick because of it. So the lack of production, they said, is due to the lack of refinement in his game. So that, to me, says coaching, that he was not coached up by whoever's defensive coordinator back when Jimbo Fisher was at A&M. And then last year, when Mike Elko was there for his first year after being at Duke, that he was not coached up to the level that scouts believe he should have been coached up to, in that his physical body type ability that he has, that they just did not get the most out of him. He's already come to Carolina for a top 30 visit. So Carolina looking at him, and they're trying to check the boxes. That's what the big thing about those local visits, those top 30s are. They want to make sure this is the right kind of guy that they want. They'll understand, why did he not produce? And could they get the most out of him moving forward, and whether he would make sense for them coming up in a few weeks looking at the draft. Now, ESPN had a really good article on Wednesday looking at some of these players that were a high variance of how league execs and scouts felt about them. And Stewart, of course, is one of those guys. And an NFC executive said, quote, big, fast, explosive, lots of physical ability. Just not sure where exactly he's going to go. The community is split on him. And this has been, of the guys I think we've talked about, there's been the most split on what he could do. Because I've always looked at production and wondered, if you don't produce in college, especially at the SEC level, the nation's best conference with the most NFL talent coming in and year out. And that's not even debatable. That's just a fact. How are you going to come into the NFL and produce? And Jonathan Mingo was one of those guys. And we saw it did not work out. DK Metcalf playing with a bunch of pros offensively at Ole Miss didn't necessarily have the numbers. People were focused on the 3-cone drill. And now he's one of the highest paid NFL receivers and certainly one of the top 10 receivers in the league. So it can be a boom like DK or a bust like Jonathan Mingo, two guys who both went in the second round out of Ole Miss. And everybody's story is different. But this, to me, is one of those boomer bust kind of guys. And Shemar Stewart, talk about his production, 4.5 sacks in 37 collegiate games. Now, pressure greater than sacks, but it wasn't like he was getting a ton of pressure either. But you want to be able to get those results. Like pressure in the NFL, obviously that you're going to go up against the best players. So you're not always going to be able to get home. But in college, man, you should be able to out-athlete, out-talent some of these dudes. It's not like A&M's playing Bama and Georgia every weekend. I'm sorry to Mississippi State fans, but come on. It's Mississippi State. It's Kentucky. South Carolina plays A&M every year. And no offense to all the South Carolina people out there, offensive line's been mostly a train wreck over the last couple of seasons, and Stewart's not producing even against some of those teams. It's not like everybody in the SEC is oozing with NFL talent every single game, and he's not going out there and making the kind of plays that you would expect. And he also said, quote, average feet, average instincts, doesn't always really know what's going on. Maybe he can work his way into being a good player at the next level, but he will need to improve in those areas. A high-ranking NFL defensive coach says Stewart deserves grace for some of his play because the A&M defensive line looked unorganized at times, and that can affect a player's bottom line. And that goes back to what Kyle Krabs, a Locked On Dolphins, Locked On NFL Scouting, and of the 33rd team where he covers the draft, was telling us on Monday that Stewart really felt like the scheme at A&M let down the player more so than the player let down the scheme that we saw this past season, as Nick Scorton was a big-time sack guy, as he mentioned, out of Purdue, comes over via the transfer portal, and, like, where was it? I know week 1 against Notre Dame where the Fighting Irish, they had lost their left tackle, Charles Jagusah, at the beginning of the season, and had a bunch of new guys in there. I was thinking, okay, with Shemar Stewart, Shemar Turner, with Nick Scorton, the Aggies are going to eat. And, well, that didn't really happen on that Saturday evening on Labor Day weekend. And we kind of sat through the rest of the year and we're waiting for it to happen. And, well, it never really did. So there's just no way that all those guys with those body types, that talent, all underperform because they're just not good enough. It has to be more than just that. So Shemar Stewart at 8, that's asking a lot. If a trade back possibility comes up, that's a guy that you got to look long and hard at and think to yourself, can we get the most out of him? Can you turn him into a player? So that's a boomer bust kind of guy that Carolina absolutely should be looking at. Terrance Ferguson, who we're going to talk more about here momentarily. He's 83rd on the PFF big board. PFF says Ferguson is a nice receiving tight end with the length to play some inline snaps. His lower run blocking impact makes marks indicate that an NFL team won't use him much in that way. His true value is a receiver and a tight end too. He visited Carolina on Wednesday for a top 30. So Carolina want to check some boxes there as far as how they feel about Ferguson. And he's got the size. About 6'6", 6'7", good athleticism, was a solid piece of an offense all 4 years at Oregon. And he feels like a guy I thought was there for like 6 or 7 years. And that's how we used to talk about people. That, like, remember Perry Ellis at Kansas who played basketball? He looked old as hell, but he was there for 4 years. Like, man, that guy's been here forever. Well, he only was there for 4 years. Now, dudes in college literally have been there for like 6 or 7 years. That's not Ferguson. He's someone who went there, made an impact immediately, was a good player for Oregon, one of the better players last year in what was a really good offense, number 1 seed, undefeated heading into the college football playoff before getting absolutely evaporated by Ohio State in that Rose Bowl. But that's someone I like. And because he's right there in that 83rd range, because Carolina brought him in on a Wednesday, I don't think they're getting Colston Loveland. I don't necessarily believe they're going to get Tyler Warren. Now, we will talk to the Locked On Penn State host at some point here, I think in the next week, and talk more about whether Warren could make sense there at 8, but maybe they get him, maybe not. But I don't think Loveland's going to be on the board when they pick again. If you're looking there at 74 early on in the 3rd round or middle part of the 3rd round, that would be the spot to take Terrance Ferguson just based off of his big board. Maybe it's too early, maybe it's too late. I don't know. But an AFC executive said about Ferguson, good athlete, probably not as physical as you'd like, not quite as finesse as Mike Gesicki, but not as physical as you'd hope, though I think he has worked to answer that in the pre-draft process and the Senior Bowl. They already have a player in Jatavion Sanders, who is a really good pass catcher his 2 years playing down there at Texas, and then had to come in and grow as a blocker overall. And you got Tommy Trimble back for another couple of years. You got JT Sanders entering year 2. So you can slot Ferguson in there and you can groom him in the way that you want to with JT Sanders. Eventually, one of those two guys is going to have to show you that they can block. And then I would think you go out there and draft, or not really draft, but go sign some other guys who could be those primary blocking tight ends. That's a spot where you're not always going to have the versatility to be able to do everything at that position. But if you can find a good blocker, which I do think is a lot easier than finding true difference makers in a pass game at tight end, and we've seen in Carolina over the last 5 or 6 years how that's been the case, I think it could work out. So that's a guy, day 2, in particular, the 3rd round to look at as he visited on Wednesday for a top 30. And the last one is Will Johnson. And I'm hoping to talk to Isaiah Hull, our Locked On Michigan host, sometime next week about Will Johnson, because he's the guy I want to look at it right there at 8. If the Panthers want to go corner, you talk about best player available. Yeah, Will Johnson may be that guy. Looking at PFF, he's 13th on their big board. They say Johnson is a long, lean cornerback of elite foot quickness and change of direction fluidity. His limited long speed will create questions about his man coverage reliability in the NFL, but having him playoff coverage with his eyes on the ball as a zone scheme white cornerback could allow him to make impactful plays more often. Now, Johnson's someone who missed a lot of time last year. I believe it was a turf toe that slowed him down at Michigan, made some big plays even when he was out there on the field and when he didn't miss it on much time. But he was somebody who a couple of years ago during the national championship season when Jim Harbaugh was still there, who was a really big piece defensively for them. Obviously, guys like Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, who are going to be big pieces in this year's draft, they're awesome and plenty of good players defensively overall. Michael Barrett was one of those guys who the Panthers took in the 7th round a year ago, but so was Will Johnson. He was expected to be one of the top corners in this draft, which still is the case, and maybe even be the top corner in college football along with Travis Hunter. He just wasn't healthy enough to do it. And now there's questions about his durability. He's 6'2", which is exactly the kind of length Carolina's looking for. When you look at Mike Jackson, look at J.C. Horn and the Seattle mold of corners, Scott Fitterer may not be here, but a lot of guys who are in Seattle are here. The coaching staff, obviously, and yes, Dan Morgan, who was there under John Snyder from day one as well. Had 9 interceptions in 32 collegiate games. J.C. Horn, I don't know if it's fair to say he's not a ball hawk, but he's not gotten a ton of interception. It would be nice to have another corner opposite of who could do that. But it's all about, can he stay healthy? Knee injury, shoulder, believe it was a turf toe as well. That's going to be something to look out, but also the scheme. And that's where it comes to boom or bust, the injuries, but also the scheme when looking at Will Johnson. Quote, he needs to be in a vision zone scheme. Let him attack what's in front of him. If you want him to match up against the best guys every down, that's not him. So if he's not one of those guys, probably not someone you're taking in the top 10 because you think J.C. Horn's that guy. And Ajero keeps his guys on one side. He does not have them travel with the best receiver, which I know a lot of people want to happen, but that's not necessarily what defensive schematics always call for, depending upon who the DC is. And the DC for this season upcoming, maybe the last season, he's not asking for that. And I don't think he really runs his own either, which is kind of a problem when the zone defenses that this exec believes would work, at least his coordinator rather thinks would work for him, would be Atlanta, Tampa, Indianapolis, Buffalo, Seattle. So again, this could be it for Ejiro Evero. And if that is the case, do you want to pass up on a potential long-term difference maker just because the scheme maybe this year doesn't fit him? We'll see. But Will Johnson, injuries aside, scheme aside, I think he's a dog. I think that's somebody that Carolina absolutely should be interested in. But again, boom or bust. So Will Johnson, Shemar Stewart, and Terrance Ferguson, 3 guys I'm looking at. And I'm very curious to see if Carolina is going to be there on Monday, I believe, in Ann Arbor to go check out Will Johnson. Those are 3 guys who be boom or bust prospects that Carolina should be looking at ahead of the draft here in 2 weeks. One of those guys, Terrance Ferguson, going to talk to the host of Locked On Ducks, Spencer McLaughlin, about him here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Getting tickets shouldn't be stressful. That's where Gametime comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Gametime Picks curation makes it easier to find better value for tickets to sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. With seat views before you buy, no surprise fees, and a lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, back here on the Locked On Panthers, and as promised, Spencer McLaughlin, he is the host of the Locked On Ducks podcast, host of Locked On College Football. Check him out over on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, and follow him on Twitter or X at SMcLaughlinCFB. Spencer, how you doing, man?
Dude, fantastic. I am more than a little intrigued to see where our former Ducks are going to become #Pro Ducks in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. And listen, like, there is an all-time Duck great in Jonathan Stewart, who came to Carolina once upon a time and became an all-time Carolina Panthers great. And I'm sure Panther fans would love to see someone from Dan Lanning's program come over here and also be an all-time great. As man, they got that thing cooking. And the fact that Oregon was able to hold on to him last year when Nick Saban retired, and now I'm looking at it, I don't see a day where Dan Lanning is not the Oregon head coach, as long as he wants to be the Oregon head coach and they want him to be the Oregon head coach. So really excited about what they got going on up there in Eugene, and also excited about Terrance Ferguson as a prospect. He came to Charlotte on Wednesday for a top 30. The Panthers still vetting some tight ends. They're in a spot where I do think heading into this draft, they should be looking at one, probably not day one at 8, but certainly getting to day 2, probably the 3rd round. That could make some sense. Tell me about Terrance Ferguson. I know he's a 4-year player at Oregon, had been a key piece of the offense from day one. What makes him special, and why do you see him as potentially a day 2 prospect in this upcoming draft?
Well, first, I love that you brought up Jonathan Stewart, because when I was growing up as an Oregon fan, that was the first kind of like borderline superstar Pro Bowl caliber player who I remember going into the NFL and following and then picking on my fantasy team when I was able to, because he was a touchdown menace and all that sort of stuff. And it's incredible the growth that Oregon football has seen from then to now, where, you know, that was kind of a rarity. And it was like, whoa, Jonathan Stewart's like legitimately good. Now it's, yeah, guy got drafted in the top 10. Yeah, Justin Herbert's one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the NFL. Yeah, Bo Nix is like you just keep going down the list. DeForest Buckner is going to be a 15-year Pro Bowl sort of guy. So I think that for Terrance Ferguson, he's got every chance to be the best Oregon tight end in the NFL since Ed Dickson, who was also one of those early guys.
And a Panther.
And a Panther as well. I don't know that they're incredibly similar. You know, Terrance Ferguson was someone who played a good amount of wide receiver when he was in high school, but by the time he came out, he was a tight end for all 4 years at Oregon. He was productive for each of the last 4 seasons. It's frankly going to be strange watching Oregon's offense without number 3 there, just catching the ball all over the field and being a good red zone target. But someone who will go through brief spurts of not catching the ball the way you'd think, but for the most part, incredibly good hands. He is a tough catch sort of guy. If you want to see an example of what I'm talking about, go back to 2023 Utah game. There's a third, I think it's like a 3rd and 7. He runs a corner route. Stupidly good catch. That's what he is and what makes him such a good target. Big frame, 6'5", moves really well. This is someone who regularly over the last few seasons caught tight end screen passes and turned that into 30 to 40 yard gains when it was properly blocked. This is a guy who, you know, they will throw the ball to on kind of these delay release, and he catches the ball within 2 yards of the line of scrimmage, and he's picking up a first down or more. Like he's not a, you know, catch it and not do anything after that sort of guy. He can really move. So I think as a pass guy, I think he's underrated as a blocker. I think he is good. He is solid. I don't think he's Rob Gronkowski or a specialist there. He's definitely more of a receiving threat than a blocking guy, but I think he's been more than good enough in the blocking game. His body is really built out. He came to college, you know, pretty built, and I think that he's kept his body in the right sort of frame for a modern day tight end, but one who moves well, catches the ball well, gives you yards after catch. I think that he has a lot of those modern tight end sort of traits.
Yeah, and I haven't watched in the last couple of years. Like, you're totally right, because a tight end screen, a lot of times I see that play call. I'm just like, what are you doing there? Because there's not a lot of athletes at that position like a Ferguson was there at Oregon and even in the NFL to where that makes sense as a play call. But it worked plenty of times, whether it was Will Stein calling the play this past year when Kenny Dillingham was up there as the OC for Oregon. And it's interesting to me because you talk about he was a high school receiver. He's come in. And I look at him, he feels still more like a receiver than a true tight end at this point in time in his career. How far do you think he is from being maybe a complete tight end? And like, what kind of impact do you think early on he's probably making as a pro? Is it more as a receiver, or could he still be kind of a 3 down, every down kind of tight end as well?
No, I think he can absolutely be an every down sort of tight end. I don't see him as, a Kyle Pitts type where it's, he's basically a wide receiver. Oregon actually has a guy like that now who's going to take his spot in Kenyon Sadiq, who might be in the NFL draft next year because he's 6'4", 6'4", 250 pounds, tops out at about 22.5 miles an hour. So he's that sort of guy. Ferguson, though, is I think a little bit more old school than maybe he is sometimes getting credit for. I think his blocking is perfectly fine. I don't think it's a liability. I don't think it's going to be a massive plus in the NFL, but I don't think you can only throw him the ball. I don't think you have to say, hey, we want to go heavy here on 3rd and 1, and we're just going, power handoff. Well, we can't have Ferguson out there blocking. I don't think that at all. I'm sorry, someone's trying to call me right now. But the thing with him is I just think he's better as a pass catcher, but he's not someone who lined up wide a ton. He definitely did, because Oregon, more than as much as anybody in the country, would run 12 or 13 personnel. Now, he was the number 1 tight end at the top of the depth chart, but I think that he is capable of lining up on the end line, split out, offset as kind of an H-back, or you can line them up all the way wide outside. I mean, they would bunch guys and run, vertical concepts out of that 13 personnel regularly last couple of seasons. So I think that he brings the whole package and does well running after the catch. He's got really good ball skills. He is a good route runner. I think he's got everything that you need to be a starting caliber tight end. Does he make that adjustment right away? That's a coaching determination on, how ready he is to make the jump from college to the NFL. I don't know how much more ready he can be, because he didn't start for 4 years. He started for 3 years and played all 4. So he's about as prepared as you can ask for in that sense. Some guys that are drafted in the 3rd or 4th round still need a year or two to, fully acclimate to the NFL game. But I think he's as ready as you can ask at that tight end spot.
Yeah, and like he's gotten plenty of reps, as you mentioned. He feels like one of those guys like pre-COVID, pre-guys playing 6, 7, 8, 9 years of college football. Felt like one of those guys like, oh, he's been there forever. It's like, no, he's just been a productive player for 4 seasons. And
right.
Like you look at him, he's still 22, still young, can get a lot out of him. And the situation that they can bring him in here to Carolina, they already have Tommy Trimble. He's a veteran. He's more of a blocker. They drafted JT Sanders out of Texas last year, and he is more of the mold, maybe not apples to apples of Ferguson, but more of a pass catcher. But he's certainly had a lot further to go as a blocker, which does not sound like to be the case of Ferguson. So he could slide in pretty nicely. I'm curious, because you also cover, college football at large with Locked On College Football, and just in particular in the Big Ten, like Tyler Warren, a lot of talk about him, a lot of talk also about Colston Loveland. How do you think that Terrance Ferguson stacks up to those two guys who I think consensusly most people would think are the better tight end prospects in this draft? Like, how far behind do you think he is, and if you think he's that far behind at all?
Yeah, I think he's more comparable to a Colston Loveland. And for Ferguson, with what he's able to do right here, right now, the other guys are better players. I don't know that there's that big of a gap. Warren is unique. Like, I saw Warren in the Big Ten championship game, and Loveland, tore up Oregon's secondary as well. Like those two guys, I have no qualms with them being ranked above Ferguson. I don't know how large the gap is compared to what people might think. It's those two guys in the field, the Moneyball line. There's these guys, and then there's these guys, and then there's 50 feet of crap. Then there's he's not outside of the 50 feet of crap range. I think he's kind of, here are these guys, and he's right there. And I say that because those two were in a situation where they were asked to do more. Ferguson, was a tight end in the midst of the greatest run of Oregon receiving talent that I've ever seen, and probably the program has ever had. And so when you contrast that and just look at the stats, yeah, Ferguson's numbers aren't going to be as gaudy or impressive. I think that is a byproduct of the offense that they're running, because when he was called upon, he was super reliable all the time. I mean, 95+% of the time, you throw him the ball, he's going to go out there and make a play. And I think that is the biggest gap between the two. Is like, he's never been asked. He's been asked to be a number one tight end for 3 years. He hasn't been asked to be a number one tight end who's the best pass catching option on his team, which is what Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland were. So yeah, I would take those. I would take those two. I think they're both better blockers than Ferguson. That's probably the biggest gap. As pass catchers, I watched Ferguson for 4 years. I don't think there's anything those guys can do that he's just there's no way he could do it. Like, why not? He's got a body, that fits a tight end mold. He's 6'5", 2. So, like, you look at him, he looks like a tight end. He's got good hands. He runs good routes. He catches the ball yards after catch. I think he's got plenty.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great point you bring up there as far as the offenses. Like, Penn State's receivers were useless last year.
They shipped him out. They shipped him out this year. They said, nope, we don't want you here anymore. You go elsewhere, that's fine. And they brought in a couple of new guys who are going to make the receiving core better, which is the right thing to do. But, I mean, their only threat, Oregon in the second half of the Big Ten championship game, I don't know why it wasn't their game plan in the first half, but they actually brought out a specialist at safety who hadn't played all year, but is 6'4", named Kingston Lopo, who's a true freshman. They brought him out to cover Tyler Warren in obvious passing downs, and then they were double teaming him the entire second half. That's like all they had. That was literally all they had. So what would Warren's numbers look like if he'd been in Oregon's offense, where you had Tez Johnson, who, if not for an injury, would have had his second straight 1,000-yard season, Evan Stewart, who's a former 5-star recruit that had over 600 yards through the air and torched Ohio State, and Trayshawn Holden, who I think could have been, a solid number 1 or high-end number 2, but was the number 3 receiver on that team. Like, what do the numbers look like there? I don't think they'd be as freakish, but certainly I'm not knocking those guys. I'm just saying I think Ferguson is closer than people might think to those tight ends.
Yeah, and situation completely matters, as you mentioned just there. Last one here. The kind of guy, the kind of person that Ferguson is. I know Dave Canales here is big on culture. I mean, everyone's going to say that, but truly here, they've tried to make sure they have the right guys in that locker room. Positivity, exudes out of Canales, and I think that's something kind of similar to what Dan Lanning is. Maybe different personalities, but still, both of you would think pretty positive guys. What kind of personality do you think would be coming in this locker room, and Terrance Ferguson, and how he might fit in as a young player?
Incredibly humble guy. This is someone who is very rooted in certainly his love for football and what that is going to do for him personally and professionally once he, is all the way done with college. But this is someone who, I've talked to him and interviewed him a couple times. Yeah. Super nice guy, super easygoing, very rooted. I think faith is pretty important to him, and just the way he just good head on his shoulders. Like, if you're someone who's about, hey, show up, get to work, don't cause any nonsense, don't complaint, don't do, this is your guy. This is someone who I think every coach that has been around him at Oregon will rave about what he has been in the locker room. He's not a super vocal kid. He's definitely on the quieter side. He's not going to be Ray Lewis in the middle of the huddle coming out the tunnel. Like, he's not. Yeah. he's not like that. He's got a mean streak to him. I watched him many a times over the years just pancake DBs and linebackers or defensive linemen who are engaged. I watch him pancake them into the turf all the time. So don't take that as, oh, he's soft, he's too nice. No. Once he gets on the field, the dude's kicking butt, taking names. But off the field, no, I would be completely and totally stunned if there are any problems or even hear anything that happens off the field. I don't even know what that would be.
The dreaded character issues.
Yeah, the dreaded character issues. Like, there are some guys you can call a spade. Like Jameis Winston coming out of college, you knew, hey, might have some character problems here. That kind of leaked over into his play a bit. This is not somebody who you have to worry about in any respect. He is as solid as they come and is going to be a plus. And I think that, that allows him to fit in Carolina or anywhere, quite frankly, because he's just someone who shows up, gets to work, and is a really good dude.
Terrance Ferguson likely going to be a day 2 pick coming up here in a couple of weeks from the University of Oregon, and a guy that I do think could fit here in Carolina. He's Spencer McLaughlin, the host of Locked On Ducks and Locked On College Football. Again, check him out over on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, at @SMcLaughlinCFB. Does a great job. Check him out on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Spencer, appreciate you today, man, and all the insight on Terrance Ferguson.
No problem, Julian. Happy to talk Ducks anytime.
Awesome. Going to take a quick pause and come back here and wrap up the show here on Locked On Panthers. Thanks again to Spencer McLaughlin, the host of Locked On Ducks and Locked On College Football. They're breaking down Terrance Ferguson, the tight end out of the University of Oregon, who came to Carolina on Wednesday for a top 30 visit, and very excited to see what happens there. I do think that he's probably someone who's more in range where Carolina should be looking at a tight end. I still think edge rusher there at 8. At 57, kind of wide open, could go receiver, could go corner, could maybe double dip, go edge. Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine at this point in time as far as what they want to do at 57. 74, maybe that's might be where you want to get a tight end. And it's a good tight end class. And looking at those Big Ten tight ends that we talked about, Tyler Warren was a stud, a unicorn, as Spencer said, and had to be the offense there at Penn State. As far as the pass game went this past year, Colson Loveland, kind of similar as Michigan lost some of their top receivers after winning the national championship, had to lean on him in the passing game. He also was a little dinged up this past year. But in Terrance Ferguson, fit into the role there at Oregon. Primary starter last 3 years, key contributor last 4, someone who can come in, work and lead by example. So very excited about him as a prospect overall, and do think that he can be a solid player wherever he lands in the NFL. And hopefully he could be here in Carolina with Tommy Trimble and JT Sanders. And then I think they'd be in a pretty good spot there at tight end, especially think about long-term having JT, Terrance, both those guys as receiving threats. That's only going to make this offense better. And we talk about the Panthers have that wide receiver 1. Well, if you don't have that, and you can be able to kind of supplement it with your running backs, be able to catch the ball in the backfield, which maybe not necessarily the case right now, but if you can have 2 tight ends, that can be big threats in the pass game. Love the idea of that. Terrance Ferguson, he visited on Wednesday and is somebody on the Panthers' radar, of course, as they could be looking for a tight end as early as day 2 in the 2025 NFL Draft in 2 weeks' time. It's going to wrap up this edition of a Locked On Panthers podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free over on YouTube, wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julian Council, where I am back tomorrow answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. So do not delay. Get those questions into me right now. You only have two more Fridays, tomorrow and next Friday, to ask me questions about the draft. So at me, DM me, at me over Blue Sky, Twitter, all that. Get those questions in right now for tomorrow's show. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding, and I'll talk to you all on Friday.